Welcome to the first roundtable in our series, Learning Change, Adaptive Social Learning for the Anthropocene Transition. I'm Ken McLeod and I'll be your host for the series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, from whose land I'm coming to you this evening. For countless generations, the Gadigal cared for this land on which the city of Sydney now stands. While brutally displaced by invading British colonists beginning in 1788, like the other over 300 distinct cultural groups that coexisted sustainably and peacefully on this continent for 60,000 years, they never ceded their land to the British Crown or any of its post-colonial governments. We honour their tenacity and resilience and express our respect for their elders, past, present, and emerging. The impetus for this series of roundtable conversations was the realization that the Anthropocene means humankind, together with our more than human planetary cohabitants, is facing change of unprecedented scale, complexity, rapidity, and unpredictability. Never before has our collective capacity as a species to learn, adapt, and create been so crucial to our survival. We have called this process adaptive social learning, and it will be a core theme running through the roundtables in which we bring together 4 very experienced practitioners in the field of systemic change, each with a distinct approach to this common imperative. So now I'm delighted to introduce to you our roundtable guests. Sam Rai has worked in the public, private, academic, NGO and social enterprise sectors. He is now specialising in innovation at the interface between social and biophysical systems, with a focus on supporting people to work with complexity in order to make better decisions, design better programs and services, and communicate their direction. Amanda Tattersall is an internationally recognised community organiser, a researcher at the University of Sydney, host of the influential Change Makers podcast, and a former trade union official. Amanda was the founding director of the Multi-Stakeholder Sydney Alliance and co-founder of the Australian national campaigning network GetUp. She is the author of Power in Coalition. Tyson Yunkaporta is an academic, an art critic, a researcher, and while now living in Melbourne, is a member of the Indigenous Apalect clan in far north Queensland. He carves traditional tools and weapons and lectures in Indigenous knowledges at Deakin University. Tyson is the author of the recent publishing phenomenon Sand Talk. Nora Bateson is president of the International Bateson Institute based in Stockholm, a teacher of and designer of research into complex living systems, and pioneer of warm data research and process design. She is a full member of the Club of Rome, the author of Small Arcs of Larger Circles, and director-producer of the award-winning documentary An Ecology of Mind on the work of her father, Gregory Bateson. All 4 of our guests will participate in all the roundtables in this series. They will each take a turn in opening up the discussion each month. This first roundtable will be opened by Nora.
And the question that I really want to ask here is, what is systems change? I mean, before we go talking about how we're going to do it and what's necessary for the implementation and the thising and the thatting and who's going to do what and what it even, how we measure it or how we discuss it, what even is it? And I wanted to start there because I don't know, I keep coming back to this image of animals that camouflage. And we look at that as them being in a kind of protection. So, you know, we have those stick bugs that live in trees, or you have you know, snakes that blend into the landscape, or you've got frogs that you can't distinguish from the leaves, or you've got butterflies and moths that have, you know, eyes on them that look like the eyes of the predators of their predators, right? And so what this says to me is that, and I think, Tyson, you have this piece in your book that I happen to have right here. Just want you to know, brother, that I've been enjoying this so much, where you're talking about be like your place. And there is a deep be like your placeness going on that is actually creating deep, unspeakable, unfindable resonances into a system of institutions, not to the earth, not to the other possible living systems that we're living in, although that's there as well. It's not gone. But the way in which all of us are essentially camouflaging, if you want to call it that, into the systems that are in our socioeconomic culture, and how our education systems, language, economics, health systems, all of this are forming through us and with us, together through us. And to me, this is kind of like the deep spot. Okay, where is this thing that we're saying we want to change? I mean, clearly, if there's not a shifting of these relationships to current systems, the experiment of the two-leggeds could come to a short end. But where's the illusion? Right? Is it in me? Is it in you? Is it something that we create together? And that's where I want to start, because this session and the series of sessions is focused on learning. And I think one of the things that I have been most interested in for the last 10 years is the question of what is systemic learning? How does a system learn? And when we've begun to research that, what we've found is that, I mean, it couldn't be any more obvious, but you know, wow, the learning isn't in any particular part of the system, it's in the relationships between those aspects of the system. So that when, for example, you learn to play violin, which I can't play, you know, where is the learning? Is it in the muscles? Is it in the music? Is it emotional? Is it in the relationship to culture and those emotions that have come through that culture? Is it in the forming and the crafting of the instrument itself? Is it in the wood that the violin is made of? Is it in the history of song and communication? Is it in the written music? Is it intellectual? Is it a relationship with your teacher? Where's the music? And so I want to start here because I know it's a hard question. And to me, this feels like the place where my work with warm data is definitely reaching. And also, I think, you know, I see a lot of this in your work, Tyson, in Sam Talk. And Amanda and Sam also, you know, I know that you are working with community and with organizations, and it's all relational process. So where are the illusions? How is the learning possible? What is systems change? Let's start there. If you're a stick bug, how do you change the tree?
Well, all symbioses, as you know, they start out as a parasitic relation. That's how they begin, you know, and then they kind of they develop that interdependence. And I guess once that's there and there's a fair bit of homeostasis, then the tree doesn't need to be changed. And, neither does the bug. But these symbioses always start out as a parasitic relation. So I guess I'd throw that back to you and say, where do you think we are now? Who is parasiting off of whom right now? And how inevitably is that going to transform into some kind of symbiosis that will, be of some kind of use and create an interdependent relation, from which a workable system, a non-self-terminating system can grow.
Yeah, I mean, what if the tree is the interinstitutional processes that we're camouflaged into, and we're that stick bug thinking, uh-oh, this tree that we're camouflaged into is trouble. And
Look, I guess if someone came along and they cut up the tree into squares and they said, this isn't a tree anymore, this is capital, and but we're still going to need you to do all the things that the stick insect does for that tree. We're going to need you to do it a little bit differently. You have a skill set we need, so we're going to keep you in this frickin' jar over here. You don't have access to the tree anymore, but we're still going to need you to produce the chemicals and everything else that you do, and we're going to need you to do that for a lot longer and with a lot less rest. And we're going to need you to spend half your life actually doing that work now. And we'll provide the things to you that the trees used to provide you with. They won't be as good. We'll just get something approximating that and poke it through the hole in the top of your jar. And people are going to come by and they're going to want to see you do your camouflage tricks, so you can put that on for us every now and then, because that's our art now. And we want to see it. Do the camouflage, perform that right now. And no, you can't go back on that tree. That's our capital now. That's our squares. We're leveraging that so that we can buy more bottles to put more of you into. We've got a whole rack of jars over there with holes poked in the top. Shut up. So I think that's where we're up to with that metaphor. So I don't know, 4 of those stick insects sort of clinking together through the glass at each other going, oh, how are we going to change the system? It's like, well, how are you going to change the system? Insect, what are you going to do? Throw that to you.
Can I jump in? I think that's quite a fun provocation. So, most of my time is spent being a stick insect, working out how the fuck are we going to change this thing, right? Like, that's my orientation as a sort of community organizer, right? That's what we think about. And I've spent a lot of time, and now I'm camouflaged at the university. I'm a geographer, right? So I'm thinking about place and how things change at different scales. So taking that question and applying it to where we are in the world. And I think the thing that, because I think it's an overwhelmingly difficult question to answer. Like, I don't use the phrase systemic change. Like, I would say I'm across it, but it's not a space that I've immersed myself in. I've placed myself in other areas. So I don't feel 100% all-knowing in answering the question, right? But if I was to look at it from a perspective as a community organizer, I always think of change as occurring at 3 different levels, all possibly at the same time and at all levels required. So firstly, it's personal and interpersonal, like you described, relational. We use the phrase relational as well as community organizers. People, if anyone who's listening in has heard the phrase relational meeting, they would understand that this concept is sort of a groundstone of how you try and make change using organising. It's very much, there's an intimacy and trying to understand how we all work, how we seek change in the world, right? Like the Gandhi-esque sort of idea, change yourself in order to change the world. So we need that kind of change. But, you know, just that, right? Like hanging out and drinking your keep cups and, you know, doing personal work and nothing else. It can be indulgent, right? There needs to be something bigger than that. You know, having a slightly nicer glass because you've become good at shining it from the inside is kind of bullshit, right? So it's also about building sort of institutional spaces around yourself, and they could be place-based, if loose, or literally institutions. So we used to always talk about organizations, working in my church, I work in my school, I work in my union, whatever it happens to be, whatever the organization is, and making that a space that is also capable of being relational. That is a space where you can go and sort out and interpret the world together, an intermediary space, a place where you can understand how the world works. But even that, like I might have a rocking church and be feeling good in myself, but if the whole world is gone to shit, right, then that's also indulgent. And so there's the third scale of change, which is, you know, maybe, I don't know, is a systemic question, but I think of it as society-wide. You know, that level of change is also required. And, you know, and I evaluate some of the change I've done in my life where I've sort of hit one level, but not the other level. And, you know, I think it can be a way of looking at how we contribute, the different scales at which we achieve change, and different scales put different pressure on the kinds of relationships we need to build. Like if I'm comfortable here in my middle-class white neighborhood, I don't need to go and hang out with anyone else. But if I want to change my city, I probably do need to get out of, you know, where I am and meet others. And if I want to change my country or my world, the depth of relationships I need with more diverse people, you know, the pressure becomes stronger as the ambition becomes stronger as well.
I'm thinking a little bit about how change happens in forests and in mature ecosystems and other sort of less mature ecosystems. A lot of my current work is in conservation, and so constantly ecology is something that's buzzing away in the back of my head. But I guess there's incremental change that happens in ecosystems, which tends to be about some kind of divergence from the pattern of creation that just keeps the same genetics rolling along, the same physical attributes, the same behaviors. Something's happened, and I guess it's a mutation of some kind, right? And so suddenly the stick bug goes from being a wonderful camouflager to bright pink. And a lot of the times those bugs get picked off. They're the first ones that the birds see. But sometimes that mutation is actually beneficial. So something about not being the same and not camouflaging with the system anymore, suddenly it's an advantage. So there's that kind of incremental change, and that can be disruptive. But I guess if you look at some of the sort of the work Nassim Taleb was bringing in with like the black swans, actually the most, we tend to downplay it, but the most disruptive things that happen are actually external big change events that just destroy an ecosystem or fundamentally change it. That could be, you know, I think used to live in New Zealand a lot on the West Coast. We had a lot of slips that would just come, big mudslides, wipe out a chunk of the forest, and you would get a new ravine for a river, and it just fundamentally changes that habitat. And so I'm wondering if there's similar things happening here, you know, the kind of change that Amanda's talking about with the big societal change, like Black Lives Matter in the States at the moment is a perfect example of this, like flare up of a complete change that may never go back to how it was before. Obviously, a lot of people are hoping that. So I'm wondering about the sort of these different types of change and how maybe they factor into the, we like to think we have control over our habitats, much like the stick bug thinks that it has control over its tree in some way and it wants to change the tree. And then at some point it realizes that it's actually down the bottom of the ravine because it's just been collected in a slit. And the tree doesn't matter anymore. So I'm wondering if there's anything in that, Nora, from your work in living systems, or yourself, Tyson, that maybe lends something towards the question of change.
Artie, just to take you back into it and into your area, coming from your genealogy in complexity, which is a profound one. I think disruption is part of the pattern of creation. It's an important part of the pattern, because if a pattern just keeps replicating over and over, it stagnates, and that's entropy. But it's the disruptions that make the pattern beautiful. As the pattern struggles to reassert itself, it's never the same again. You have those earthquakes in New Zealand and you think, oh my God, that's destroyed the reef. But no, it's opened up an entire new ecological niche there, and the reef just suddenly, within weeks, there's this startling diversity going on in the reef that wasn't there before, and it's actually helped the reef, and the reef has changed. You get that mudslip and there's a new ravine. There's a new ravine. The river changes its course. This is how things happen. And when you get demotic change, in a culture, and a spontaneous uprising, something like that, something that hasn't been tinkered and planned and designed behind the scenes by people with different little machinations going on in the background. When something happens like that, it is it's like a flash flood. It's like an act of God, or whatever you want to call it, but it's a pattern breaker, which is the pattern maker, which makes the intricacy of the pattern, and it actually increases the connections between things, within that system. It stirs it up and forces new connections to be made, and actually increases relatedness and the capacity for that relational exchange of value and information or knowledge or spirit, that where that warm data sits. That's when that happens. But that's a very different thing from a lightning strike of a tree in a forest, or a mudslide that wipes out half that forest. That's very different, from that tree being cut up into square blocks, and the stick insects being placed in jars, and every now and then being, I don't know, steered into doing some kind of gammon uprising where we sort of go, we want to have a say in the jar production. We want jobs cutting up the trees into squares too. We want to have equal participation in the destruction of this forest. And I'm sick of them ladybugs over there. Whinging, anyway. So is disruption, an important part of the pattern, and when is it organic, demotic, and how do you know the difference, Auntie?
I mean, first of all, I just love this, the revolution of the sticks bugs in the jars wanting better jobs putting the trees into cubes, because it feels like that, and I don't think that metaphor is so far off. There's something that stirs for me here around your question of when is that thing organic? When is it coming from the core of these systems that are working together? And when is it a charade, a script, a hack, right? You can't hack this. there's something in the underground there. There's something unspeakable. There's something about the way life makes life that is outside of language, and I think a lot of times it's outside of perception. In your book, you talk about how the old fellas can see those relationships that show that relationships are changing, right? When it comes to the SDGs, we just look for the impact measurements. And so there's something very linear going on in the way we're thinking about how to even see what changes have happened. And that in my work, what I see is that thing that is happening is never happening where you think it's happening. So, there's a disruption. There's some way in which these patterns are crossing, are coming together, are linking, are intersteeping, are merging in ways that are different. And in that moment, there's new possibilities, but those possibilities are not where you're looking for them. They're somewhere else. And so I think one of the issues we get into with looking for, to how to do systems change, or where is the change, is looking, it's that metaphor. I was talking about it just last night of the drunk guy who's looking for his keys under the light. And, the guy says, what are you doing? I'm looking for my keys. He says, well, is this where you dropped them? And he says, no, but this is where the light is shining. This is where I can see. And that the change is happening somewhere else, but it's not on the spreadsheet, because the spreadsheet is part of an old way of looking. And the actual shiftings are happening through relational process that's kind of in the underground. So I guess that's kind of what I would add to that, is that in the question of what is systems change, the other side of that is what are we perceiving and where are we looking?
I often, in thinking about this, I often use a metaphor of a theatre in which there's been a background that we have been a backdrop of the stage that we've been able to kind of take for granted for quite a long time, and in the language of earth sciences, that was the Holocene. It was a period of a fairly high degree of predictability. And, we had different theories about historical forces that brought about change, whether it was class conflict or whatever it was. But in front of that backdrop, we tended to act out our human dramas, assuming that the backdrop was a kind of a constant, mostly constant. Now, it seems to me, we're facing a situation which you're touching on now, where the backdrop itself is radically changing. We're facing a state change in the Earth system. So the dynamics of how we engage with change are shifting constantly now, because the context is shifting constantly. And that, to me, poses some very big questions of how we even perceive change, let alone how do we engage with it. And I'm interested, Amanda, how that kind of framing might impact on the community development model.
It's such it's a really difficult question in a way, because some of this conversation makes me probably a little bit defensive and maybe a little bit agitated, that we can spend all this time debating about whether change is real while Rome burns, and clearly we need a different state from what we're in. And I would prefer us to be acting rather than just contemplating in some of these moments, right? So cards on the table. That is sometimes my reaction to this conversation. Then the other reaction is, like, as someone who is involved in lots of different forms of social change, but also I do a lot of teaching and training of people who are involved in those spaces. Like, people really don't know what to do, right? There's this sort of quite deep yearning of what should I be doing, you know, to make the change. And a lot of people who are in that situation, they act, right? Like, they do something, they act, and they run a million miles at problems, doing things that probably aren't going to solve the problem, right? Like, they might feel better because they've acted, but you know, whether it's anything from the parents at my sustainability committee at my kids' school who are working really hard to do a waste audit, and it's so beautiful and it's just so fucking useless. Like, it's just not, they could do anything in addition, like, separate to that, and they'd probably feel more than that, right? And so part of me is like, worries about this, that we could spend too long spending about, like, you know, measuring change, judging change, are we seeing change in the right places, that sort of stuff. And then this other place is very much focused on the fact that those who aren't asking questions about a more I would call it a more powerful or more grounded form of change, are doing the wrong, like, will do things that won't satisfy them, you know, because what I see in those who feel ungrounded is that they're not building the relationships that are going to change them in the process of whatever transformation they achieve. And, you know, that's what I learned as a community organizer, was to slow down. Like, I was just building all these social movements, you know. Tyson talks about building organic. I was building organic things all the time, anti-war movements, peace movement. Like, we were just doing all this crazy stuff, and it was very fun, but it was just burnt you out, you know. It was completely unsustainable. It sort of broke you when you lost, you know. And what we didn't do was the nurturing, you know, Sam, your point about, you know, the sort of learning from nature, like this sort of life-giving practice. We didn't do enough of that. And when I found community organising, I found those things come together. At the same time, community organising is no perfect nirvana, and I've spent plenty of time seeing its limits as well. But all of that is just to sort of say, I think that someone put a question in the chat about how do the different scales of change interact with each other. And I do think that there is something of course, we want to achieve global change and systemic change, but if we don't build it from the ground up, then we miss something. We don't build it relationally and sort of intimately. If we don't change in the process of change, if all we become is burnt out rather than bigger people, then we're not doing it right. I don't even know if I answered your question, Ken, but that was my reaction to this conversation.
Well, I, as we were talking about it, I had the image of the surf, and I thought, well, we don't say, oh, well, we have to change the waves, they're not working as we want them to. We say, how do we interact with the waves? And it seems to me that's the question in some ways is not how do we make change, but how do we interact with change? And Nora, I've heard you talking about changing perception being a form of action. And I think that's really quite important in these times. In some ways, we need a different set of glasses, a different set of lenses to see what's happening through, whether it's a complexity lens or whatever it is. Because unless we perceive differently, we're not going to act differently. And if we don't act differently, we're just going to replicate the same problems.
I mean, I think for me, as I'm Amanda, I completely agree with what you're saying. So it's, you know, it's a question, I think, that has something to do with also who am I? And at a very basic level, that is getting at how am I in relationship? What are those relationships like? What are those relationships opening into in other relationships? Where do those relationships go, right? It's never about the first level of relationship. It's about what relationships does that open up? And I think one thing that has been a big sort of shift for me in perception, and I'm trying to think if this is actually true, because I've kind of been around this a long time, so I don't really know where the beginning is, which strikes me as something that is intrinsic in all change, that you can't really find the beginning of it. Even when it's a landslide or a demonstration or a disruption or whatever it is. But that I am not alive to pursue a life that seems anything like what was there when I was in 4th grade, what I was kind of sold as the life plan. That I am alive in a time of huge transformation. And why is that word singular? It really should be plural, transformations. And that means a different kind of attention to what's going on around me, how I'm engaging in relationships, how I'm perceiving. It's like paying attention to the fact that the script I was given is not the one that's applicable to the world that I'm living in. And recognizing that you know, if we're alive right now, we're alive in a time of many things that used to cohere to a particular set of scripts aren't cohering anymore. Which is, to Tyson's point, I think it's probably a good thing. But the disruption could also, we could be that landslide that opens up for a new ravine. So it has something to do with recognizing that those of us who are here right now are here in a time where we have to ask these kind of questions, and that there is a sense of very rigorous not knowing. It's not just, it's unknown and ambiguous and we have to live in the spaces in between, which we do. But there's a depth and a rigor and a curiosity and an integrity to that is it's rich and sexy and funny and horrifying and tragic all at once. And so for me, I think there's something there too about just who am I in relationship to this time.
There's just, it's a very tricky and collective kind of action that you need, that can't really be led or directed, or I keep joining these groups, and it's you can almost count down the days until somebody will appoint themselves a committee of that group and start sending around email with schedules and action statements and mission statements and all kinds of things. You know what I mean? It's never long, and as soon as it starts getting designed in that way, it's no good. And and the only paradigms people have to fall back on outside of that are kind of out of the box thinking, or like non-linear thinking. What's that one De Bono does, that lateral thinking? But De Bono's solution to peace in the Middle East to send him some Vegemite is where he finished up. His entire that's lateral thinking is not holistic thinking. It's just use lateral thinking to decide, these Arabs is aggressive. They're aggressive, and where does aggression come from? It comes from vitamin B deficiency. Where do we get vitamin B? Vegemite. Yes, let's send a bunch of Vegemite to the Middle East. That'll sort them out. It sounds like pretty much everything, every response to the COVID thing that's happened, absolutely blown me away. So, let's say, how do you respond in an organic and demonic way, to managing the business of COVID? So who's got their eye on, oh man, in a few months, we're going to need a lot of speech pathologists, because there's a lot of 2-year-olds right now who haven't said their first word yet. Has anybody got their eye on that? How can we all keep our eye on every single problem? How do women begin to collectively figure out the problems that are coming from them being separated from the women that they usually spend their days with, from the big, collective groups of women who their cycles are all in sync together, and now all of a sudden they're not. And there's all these women experiencing all these very erratic cycles, and it's having quite an intense biological effect. And that's about all I can say about that. But my woman's got some thoughts on it, and the problems that is causing, that she's seeing in the psychological effects, the knock-on effects for family and kids. It's happening with all these women everywhere who need to be together and they're not. What's all the knock-on effects of that? And who's going to be on cleanup for all that? And who's going to train and allocate all these speech pathologists for all these kids who can't talk because they haven't seen another kid for a year? So they've missed out all this developmental stuff, like 2 tiny things that we might not have seen. There are 1 billion of those things, and just with COVID. And COVID is one tiny little hair on the head of a meta crisis, which is like, a thick and lustrous weave that's heaps better than Donald Trump's, I tell you. So we got De Bono saying we'll send Vegemite. And we've got, as of Sunday midnight, we've got the US imposing those, Security Council sanctions against Iran that the Security Council has said no to, but they're just saying, no, we're going to go with them anyway. So what's our collective action, Amanda? How do we organize around that? Do we do a little protest? Because they seem to be working really well these days. It's like, it's like, as remedies go, it's a bit like, bleeding patients in the bloody 13th century to fix their, to sort out their wandering wombs. I can't see how you can organize to sort that out. But there is somewhere in the system, of butterfly effects where you could do something. It might be a 3-year-old would do something that would cause a chain reaction that would sort that out, and potentially, not end up with a massive war. Where we end up with, Israel that's got nukes, Pakistan that's got nukes and running out of water. Where we don't end up sort of, in annihilating the entire hemisphere, and then everybody trying to piss off down here for Lifeboat Australia because of the temporary Coriolis effect. There's a lot of stuff about to kick off. We got an October full of surprises, and there's no single mind that can be on that. So what does organizing even mean in the face of that?
It's a good question. Make it.
How do you organize change in a complex adaptive system?
So I guess it depends on, just to respond, it depends on what you think you're organizing for. So there are there's 2 ways of seeing change being made, or philosophies on the approach to change. There's more than this, but I'll simplify it, right? There are some people who go, tell me the issue and we'll work out a solution together, right? So therefore, they build a long shopping list of crises, like what's the problems you identified, right? There's issues in terms of, mental health and child development and water in Pakistan, and there's just a long list of crises, right? It's devastatingly terrible list of things that are going wrong, right? You see things from an issue perspective. Or another way of seeing things is seeing things from a power perspective. And to say that it's the analysis, the reason why all the things go wrong at the same time is not because we've got an incredibly terrible shopping list problem, but that actually that we've got a power problem, and that the excessive power of too few people with too little interest in anyone else, say market players, who have clutched the hands of government, right? That those narrow interests are hurting the interests of others. And that power problem is the reason why you've got these very different things on your shopping list, but they're all sort of coming from the same source. Now, before COVID, right, the theory went that what you got to do is you've got to rebuild the power of people to advocate for themselves. I'm not here to advocate for you. You're not here to advocate for me. But if you have the skills to advocate for yourself and the network to do that, and I have the skills to advocate for myself, and I have a perspective on the things that are going wrong in the world that allows me to sort of see that actually you going well and me going well, the rising tide lifts all boats, then things could maybe shift, right? So that, that's our perspective, right? Some could call it sort of a mix of communitarianism with an added jolt of power, because most communitarians don't have an understanding of power, right? But COVID, I think, does change it, not simply because of the health crisis, because of the economic crisis and the climate crisis, which means that, oh my gosh, what do we do? So the first response is, let's just, before we work out our response, and there are some people who are confidently going, there is a singular response of what we need to do, right? Which is, I accept, probably based on issues, it's probably not the best way forward, but there are those responses. But let's look at what the people who have more sided with the narrow set of interests are doing. They have a response to this too. Authoritarian nationalism, despotism, whatever you want to call it, basically highly functional in most countries around the world, bar some of Europe, maybe Canada, New Zealand, bless New Zealand. Australia's not got a taste of it compared to what's going on in other places. But there is already a mode of accumulation, a theory of how to run the world that's responding to COVID that's worse. The disruption has created the opportunity for a worse outcome, for so many people, at least for the moment. But it's still a crisis and no one knows what they're doing. And so it's all in flux, right? There's this sort of moment of flux. And I think in that moment, so I would say, I would have confidently said, I know how to organize. I'm happy to confidently answer the question of how to organize, even though frankly, we hadn't been very successful. I have a theory on that. But now, I think that this is the time for the deep reflection, and Nora's idea for a sort of a holding to radical uncertainty, and for people to put down their arms a little and think about what's really required, because we've not seen something like this. Arguably, most of us have not seen something like this. I think some of us have seen crisis like this before. Colonialized populations have, but many average white people like me haven't. And that is there's an opportunity for rethinking of almost everything.
That kind of brings us back to that question of perception too, doesn't it? Because in some ways, underlying questions are, how do we see what is going on when it's not what we expect to be seeing? And that's one of the big challenges of the times we live in. And how do we make sense of what we see? And this might partly relate to the community organizing process too. Amanda, how do we probe complex systems in order to better understand their dynamics? That often a campaign is effectively a kind of probe. We're seeing that in the United States at the moment with the Black Lives Matters. That campaign is revealing profound things about the American body politic and about American culture. It's a probe in a sense.
It's particularly interesting that, I mean, you know, almost every war going on right now, every kind of conflict is a war for perception, you know, and for arriving at, you know, a dominant perception, or to force, you know, this idea, this mistake, this illusion that we can somehow change reality by changing our perception of reality. And yet each of us has our own unique perception, our own unique standpoint, and that somehow that must be heard, and that must come out on top and be valued, and everybody's sort of battling for, you know, from these group identities as to whose perception will rule them all, and you know, gather enough followers around it to force the change that we want to see in the world. But what are we going to change? Everybody's perception. We're going to change everybody's language. We're going to change everybody's paradigm. But there is no change in what, you know, coming from Amanda's tradition and her genealogy of experience and knowledge, there's no change in condition, which is what people used to march for, would be to change for a change in condition. But a lot of what people are fighting for now is just change in perception, and that's tricky, you know. So I decided to put a background up, Ken, because you got that deadly background there, so I put one too. That's from the movie Pitch Black with Vin Diesel. You can't see him there because he's sneaking around, hiding, waiting to kill people, but he's he's not in that picture. But that was the first movie I ever saw, and I don't think there was one before that, which depicted an Aboriginal Australian person in the future. Mm-hmm. So that's him there beside my head. He's from Western Australia, that actor. Yeah, and I was so excited. I'm like, yes, blackfellas in space. This was decades ago. And yeah, he didn't last long. So their spaceship has crashed on a planet, and they've got to fix it. And they've got to fix it before dark, or we're all going to get eaten by these monsters, these alien monsters, you know. But the captain there to the right of my head, she knows some other things because they're there for a reason. And the guy with his back turned in the background there, he's Black Ops. You know, there's lots of different agendas going on. Right over on the right there, you've got a university professor. They used Australian actors for this because, you know, they spent all their money on Vin Diesel, so they had to get Australian actors on the cheap. And that kid there, he's a trans kid. And then you've got back behind me there, you've got a bad girl who's good with her hands. But I think you know who's going to be the first one to die, don't you? Because for some reason, the blackfella's the one who has to run off and dig all the holes that need to be dug on his own, as far away from the ship as possible, because they need some holes dug for some bloody reason to fix the ship. And, so he's the first one that gets eaten by aliens. And me, I guess if this is a spaceship Earth metaphor, there's no way. I'm not even standing on the roof with that mob. I could be hiding in the toilet and I'm just poking notes out through the thing going, watch that guy, he's Black Ops. Look behind you, there's some aliens. And I think that's about where I'm at now. That's a bit gutless, eh?
Thanks, Tyson. Look, can we get ready to take some questions fairly soon, because we're moving towards that time. It also strikes me that we've been doing a lot of kind of scoping in the discussion tonight, and we have laid a platform for exploring this whole question of what is the nature of the learning that needs to happen in a society that's facing the unpredictable and the unknowable. It's not the learning that we get at school. It's not the learning that happens in most formal institutions, because it's not individual learning, it's collaborative learning. And what about? And how do we think about that learning? So I'm foreshadowing where we might be heading with this discussion?
I think where we're heading within the framework, Ken, while we're waiting for the question, is the, you know, in the Anthropocene transitions thing, I think you sort of wisely focused on, you know, something that we can do is to create the pedagogies and the ways of doing knowledge production and knowledge transmission in a time of transition, to create transitional cultures, both to survive what's coming, but also to leave the cognitive tools and the good narratives behind for the people who are coming next, who are going to be on the 1,000-year cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to pick one of these questions. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of interested in this one about, in the same vein as the difference that makes a difference, could the change that makes a change be not to aim for change, but to simply be in right relationship? And I never know what right relationship is, because it seems to me that that's got to be a changing thing. Which brings us back to the beginning of the question, which I kind of like, because I think, you know, one of the nice tensions that we have in this conversation today is the down to earth, you know, Amanda, on the community level, what is being done aspect, how is my life changing, to also this sort of, you know, other level of, wait a minute, but who am I in the change, and how is it that I have somehow become a minion of existing systems that just want to perpetuate themselves? And so this kind of tension between these two processes, I think, is an interesting kind of ground of asking this question: which are the changes that make the changes? And for me, when I say change, I definitely mean learning, change and learning. But just, I need to also say that for me, not all learning is somehow positive or in the right relationship or in the right direction. You can, you know, you can learn to be violent. You can learn to withhold affection. You can, that's learning too. So what's happening in the mutual learning process? And yeah.
Although I do want to speak to the right relationship and agitate a little bit whoever wrote it, which is like, I think that there's always a question about being in relationship with other people is fine, but if I'm literally just only in right relationship with my other middle class, samey friends on my block, then that's not much. You know, I'm sure people in some pretty nasty groups are in right relationship with each other because they're close. I think it has to be about being in unusual relationships and pushing ourselves in the kinds of relationships that we find ourselves. So just to say that I think that if things are comfortable, then you're not getting anything done for yourself as much as anyone else. Like, we need to have a level of discomfort, a level of being challenged in the things that we do, I think, to feel alive. Just sorry to preach on that. But the question that I now have lost, because there's actually a lot more questions there, come back to me. It's a question about power, and someone talks about who has the power, and is power diffused, is it the complexity? So look, power is one of those words a bit like change, where we could like spend, maybe I'll do mine, whenever I do mine, I'll do it on power, because I think it's a really interesting topic. There's lots of cool books. There's lots of different ways of talking about it. But, you know, to give away, if I end up doing it based on power to me is the ability to act. And so rather than, I think that everyone has power. I have power, Nora has power, Tyson has power. We're not powerless. No one's powerless. But acting with power is easier for some and more difficult for others. And it depends on your access to organize its relationships, organize people, organize money, and organized ideas, right? Like that sort of trifecta of resources in the most simplistic way. Like, I'm not going to write an article about it, but but I really do think that speaks to how we access power. And we don't have much cash, so it's our people that really matter. But I think that there is, like Foucault, right, talks about the diffusion of power, and that power is manifest in everything. I think that there's a truth to that. I also think that it is okay to have a more macro assessment of power, what we call in organising a power analysis, where we sort of work out who is more likely to exercise power so things can get done. Now, it might sometimes produce a narrow perception of change, that if I move this person and that happens and then change occurs, right? I'm not suggesting it's the definitive way of working, but it's incredibly, I think it's important to recognize that some people have more power than others, and that to get things to make, for things to change, one needs to have an analysis of how power works in order to move to move those decision makers to work differently. And so I just thought I'd throw in, there's a little whole thing about power that we actually think it probably would be quite an interesting thing to unpack at a future discussion. But just to say, just like the word change, the word power has lots of different connotations, because I'll bet you people who are listening to this panel, I say the word power and half of you go, oh, that's awful, nasty, evil people have power. I don't have power. I don't have power. The evil people have power, because power does bad things to people. And there's truth to that. And there's also another side to that, that I think that if we are interested in making the world different to how it is now, if we are interested in the question of change, then this question of power is equally important.
I wonder if there's been traditionally the expectation, if you're used to having that power, if you've amassed that sort of sense of resources, cash, relationships, and you're used to hoarding that, you're kind of used to control to some extent. And I'm thinking a lot about as we're talking about change, like this sense of control versus influence keeps sort of cropping up in different ways without really being named. And I think traditionally, strategic planning is this perfect example of us thinking that we control change. So we'll write our 5-year plan and we'll expect everything to happen. And then we'll be surprised when it doesn't. And I think this comes from this illusion of control over change. So I'm wondering, given this sense that potentially power and control are interlinked, maybe they're not sort of direct, but there's this sense that if you have power, you think you can control the change in some way. I wonder, in this time of growing complexity, more volatility, less certainty about how that change happens, is this also the opportunity where changes that we don't expect to happen are more likely? And can they stem from different sources? Can we use different forms of power, different relational, different ways of being together, and different ways of sharing what we know and what we do, to bring about that change in different ways from how potentially it's happened in the past?
My spouse, Megan's probably given me the best sort of theoretical perspective on power that I've heard for a very long time. So she's doing her doctorate on, looking at blockchain and the whole idea of, they're trying to solve this idea of, distributed power and, all that sort of thing, you know how they go, all the ones who Silicon Valley Dungeons and Dragons dudes who are going to create these distributed power and value systems for us digitally.
How's
so
that working with Bitcoin?
She's looking,
distributed, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, she's looking at that from an Indigenous perspective and looking at what the lens of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous governance systems can bring to that. And she asserts very strongly that in our law, in Aboriginal law, power and authority are always separate. They're always separate things. So the elders have authority, but they don't have power. The power is in the people, in the entire group, and it's distributed throughout the group. And every now and then these temporary hierarchies emerge for different purposes in different places with different people who are speaking for different country, etc. You know, so everybody kind of gets the opportunity to lead at different moments, you know, and that power is distributed. But the authority sits with the elders, and she asserts that under our law, trust cannot exist, and trust is a really important part of this. It's really important. Trust cannot exist when power and authority get concentrated into one place. So there's a reason power and authority are separated, and that's to make sure that trust can exist, because you can't function, no system can function without trust, you know. And she sort of sees that in this Western model, not this Western model, but the global civilization, the Anglosphere model, that you have the state is supposed to have the authority. You know, in the ideal utopian vision of democracy and liberalism, the state holds authority and the corporates hold power. And at any time in history when you see a merging of state and corporate, then you end up with that merging of power and authority, and that's fascism. That's what happens. So you got all them little oligarchs pinging around in there, and it just bleeds over into each other, and you end up with power and authority both resting within one powerful group, and that's when things go bad. So she's warning against that. She's having to do a presentation today. That's why I'm so exhausted, because you know, if she's got to work on something, then I got to manage the kids all day. But you know, because she has the authority in this house and they have the power. Hey, I think I'm the trusty one. I don't know. Hey, but yeah, she had to do this thing on scalability, you know, of systems, and how do we scale a system with distributed governance models, you know. And her answer is that you know, indigenous systems, governance systems, don't scale. That's, she's calling it, what is it? She's calling it syndicated diversity. So we have lots of very small, you know, independent, almost like local governments that are syndicated together, you know, under sort of a continental common law of like rainbow snake, for example, ceremony. And that within that, people are, you know, having that free exchange, but also maintaining integrity of borders without anybody trying to annex anybody's land or steal their shit. So you have balance and you have trust in that. And you always keep that authority and that power separate, and that's how it works. But she's saying that doesn't scale well. You know, you can't have, you know, 7 billion people, you know, all under one sort of centralized group that has authority and another one that has power. That's not going to happen. It's going to tend towards fascism because you can't have trust there. What do you think about that theory?
I'm thinking about a friend of mine that I was talking to this morning who was in a phone call with someone she used to work with who just got made CEO of a very big multi-billion-dollar corporation. And she's been trying to talk to that person about, you know, what kind of things need to happen. But that person can't do those things because they are completely caught in the web of structural controls. So it would appear that that CEO position would be a position of power. But that person is completely stuck in what it is to be in that position, which is to be basically the servant of the board and the stakeholders. So it's a loop. And it's really hard to figure out where this relational process actually is. In some ways, you could say that the consumers, I think, you know, have the power. But the consumers don't really have the have the power because they just are, you know, what am I going to buy? You know, Nikes or Adidas. I need a pair of shoes. So do I have the power? Not really. And then is it middle management? Like where is it? And so I think that this is something that is sometimes, especially with the way that the matrix factor, okay, it's the matrix factor, that the system is trying to self-perpetuate. So if you have people who are in leadership, influential positions, their leadership and their influence is contingent upon whatever their position is remaining. So it's very difficult for them to dismantle their own processes, because then they lose their leadership or influence. I don't know what to say about this, but it does go round. And it's not a sympathy grab for the people who are in those positions. It's more like an examination of who actually can stop the train. And I don't know. It's not as easy as I have thought in the past, because of the systemics that lock us together. And it's one thing that I think about the pandemic that's actually very interesting, is that, like Amanda was saying, it kind of came and revealed so much all at once. And with this stuff that I do with the warm data work, I work with this idea of things being trans-contextual, that they are happening in more than one context simultaneously. And that, of course, that's true of your identity or of any living system, that there's lots of different processes happening simultaneously. And how we think about that, how that thing is continuing, I think is tricky. It's just tricky because it's in multiple contexts at the same time. And you can try to, put it out over here and make a policy, but the culture comes back and pulls it back in. And this is something that in this process that I've been working on called the Warm Data Lab, or the People Need People process, it's about allowing people to see things through different contexts. One thing that I have noticed was, I think, important about the Black Lives Matter is that it came after the big reveal that the pandemic showed the world that the institutions that we have been living in are flawed deeply, and that they weren't actually able to respond in the way that they needed to at health care levels, education levels, economic levels, political levels, media. I mean, you name it, every which way that was, whoops, we are not equipped to deal with this. So everyone was actually, a lot of people were in a discussion and a new perception of complex intersystemic failure. And then when George Floyd got killed, that death landed in an ongoing conversation from another context. But it allowed people who had never before been able to perceive what systemic or institutional racism was, they started to get it. Those nice, lefty folks who were like, yeah, but I'm not a racist, suddenly started to say, oh, but actually, maybe I need to own this. And of course, that didn't happen with everybody, but there were people for whom there was a real shift there. And I think that shift was made possible because they were seeing this through another context.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about, how systems learn and where power is, I think this is something to think about within that, of how one context gives meaning to another, or gives vitality, or gives a reflection of credibility or authorization to another, which is a tricky house of mirrors, because you think you can address the issue where it is, and then it turns out that some other context is the way that we get through it, right? The way that the perception shift happens, and then the actions shift.
Sam Altman's thrown out an interesting reference there to a Yin Paradis paper. I'm not sure if people have read. It's worth a look. Unsettling Truths, Modernity, Decoloniality, and Indigenous Futures. Really worth a look. So Yin's taken a very interesting turn lately and a bit controversial. He's suggesting that it's actually not ever going to be possible, certainly within our lifetimes, for us to get our land back as Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people. We're not getting our land back. That's not going to happen. But that a more pressing and urgent issue is that we need instead to find a way to bring settlers into country and under Aboriginal law. So rather than trying to kick the settlers out, as if we'd ever be able to make that kind of change, no matter how well we organized, that we need to, find a way to bring, and this comes back to right relation, because not just right relationship with each other, we need to bring settlers back into right relation with the land. And this ties a lot of things together. Basically, that's an imperative. If we can't do that, if we can't bring settlers and other non-Aboriginal people, and even Aboriginal people who disconnected from the land, all the people disconnected from the land, if we can't bring them back into right relation with the land under Aboriginal law, then everything and everyone is going to die. So we need to figure out how to do that. And I think that's going to be done through that idea that Nora introduced earlier, that idea of like being like your place, that we need to recognize what's happened to the place around us, and that we're no longer stick bugs on the tree. So we can't be like the tree. We're going to have to be like the glass for a while, until they can't see us anymore and they take the lid off looking for, where's my bug gone? And then we go fly out and stick them in the eyeball. Nah. See, those metaphors are falling apart now, Nora. But yeah, be like your place, I think, is a really important thing. And I want to bring that back to Amanda too. Like, being in right relation is not just about being in relation, with our exclusive groups. It's about being in relation to place as well. But then making sure that your exclusive groups, when you got your relations right in that you're bringing that group into right relation with the other groups that are out there as well. Because if we can't find a way to bring all of our narratives, conflicting as they are, alongside each other, and start to see the aggregate truth of all those narratives together in those warm places in between, then we're not going to do it. We're not going to be able to bring everybody in. We're not going to be able to collectively be like our place and syndicate in all of our glorious diversity across that, and allow actual, true, demotic, organic emergences, which pretty much is they're the only solutions that are going to work, the things that emerge from that collective practice.
Good. Any other response to questions?
I think there was, I think Evelyn had mentioned at this point in 2020, I'm running out of the big questions and I'm mostly holding a cry with all the unknown. I've picked up how to act from that and how to act when you really don't know. It feels like I just want to acknowledge that, really, like the sense that 2020 is has been huge and just disrupted all of us. Like, I think speaking from a sort of relatively recent experience of grief, I feel like, we're all grieving for a life we once lived to some extent. And sometimes you just need to be with that. And sometimes you need to be with other people who are also in that grief and will just sit with you in that grief. And I guess my sense of when you feel ready to be with other people, whatever that means this year. Yeah, like I think that sense of being able to make sense together, whatever making sense means at the moment, but that sense that we can work through whatever it is, integrate it, and learn to move forward. It's something that we're all working with this year. So yeah, I just wanted to particularly acknowledge that that comment on the thread there.
Do you have a question? Yes, Amanda.
I just wanted to throw in a couple of thoughts, like just on that question and linking back to the conversation about control. There's a couple of conversations about sort of playing with control on the Q&A, and one of them is from Yasmin, which is again sort of going, you know, this talking about control is sort of beyond the bounds normally. I also think it's worth sort of taking on, when do we understand, or when is a person or when are a group of people likely to appreciate that being out of control is okay? Because actually that happens all the time. It's just that I don't think that we allow ourselves the process to experience it. And I was thinking, you know, losing control, a good example of when all of us lose control is when we grieve someone's death, you know, or grieve a massive transformation in our own lives in both forms, right? And we go through a process of longing and sadness and anger and all those things about handling something that we expected and it's no longer there. And I sort of feel like might be something in that, to thinking around this question of control, because yeah, like there is a toxicity around control, linking back to something that Tyson said. There's a perception that we have control, which is just ludicrous. I think some of us, I know I had a moment in my adult life where I completely lost control, like when control was taken or whatever. And even though it was super shit, it actually in some ways was a blessing, because it's given me a greater insight. And I think that lots of us do have that, and actually being able to look at that closely could be quite useful. I also just wanted to acknowledge there was a question from Thea around historical lessons. Has it ever felt this bad before? And is there anything that we can learn from crises in the past? And all I would say, Indiana Jones, fantastic. What are you doing to us, Tyson? We should all turn around and shoot him. But all I'd say is, yes, there's so much stimulus in past historical lessons. And I reckon there's a bunch of biographies and stories out of, whether it's just the 2008 financial crisis or the Depression, particularly in the United States, because there's just so much good writing around the New Deal, that, and there's a new book by Robert Putnam who talks about some of those periods of history as well, that I reckon even if the little that you get out of it is the kinds of leadership traits that you can see, you know, and they're not things like was an asshole, ignored everyone. They were highly relational figures who were broad-based in the people that they worked with, nurtured and cared for others. Those people historically, whether they're at the front of history or part of history, they were the ones who made a difference. And so I think there's lots to learn about the fact that humankind has gone through terrible things before, and there's insights from those periods too.
Well, I just want to say thanks, you guys, for letting me lead off today. And I think we opened up a lot of things that we can draw from as the conversation develops. So that was my hope. And I'm so pleased with everybody's beautiful input. So thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Nora for stirring the possum, as we say, and leading off into this discussion tonight, which has ranged widely, but also, I think, very creatively, potentially opening up so many questions. To thank Amanda, Sam, and Tyson for your part in the discussion, and to thank all the people who are online.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Sam.
you,
Thanks,
thank you.
Tyson.
Thanks,
Thank
Kim.
you, Ken.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.